Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another session of Islamic Authors. It gives me immense pleasure this week to welcome from across the Atlantic Professor Darryl Li. Darryl is at the University of Chicago, an anthropologist, and also trained as a lawyer. You'll forgive me, Darryl, you were trained at Yale as a lawyer. I should have sort of made an earlier note of that. And Darryl is also the author of a fascinating new book, a book entitled The Universal Enemy, and the subtitle, which I'm not being able to pull up right now, has the word solidarity and the challenge of solidarity. So if you can remind me of the actual sort of full subtitle again, forgive me, Darryl.
Oh, no worries. The book is called The Universal Enemy, Jihad, Empire, and the Challenge of Solidarity.
Thank you. And this is a work which, in many respects, subverts a lot of the sort of shibboleths that I think kind of litter the post-war on terror context, particularly in academia. So in many respects, this is actually a rather severe critique of the entire sort of terrorism studies industry, whether it's in academia, but you're also someone who, as a trained lawyer, have been working in this sort of arena as someone, in a sense, engaging with, classified documents and engaging states, often on behalf of people who have been caught up in the dragnet of the war on terror, as it were. So, it really gives us a fascinating insight into so many actually disciplinary perspectives, because you're a lawyer, you're an anthropologist, you're also, of course, as an anthropologist, very self-conscious about your positionality and your own personal story. I don't want to sort of tell your story in advance of your opportunity to do so, but I just want to remind viewers that the usual format that I adopt here is that I ask the author to kind of give an overview of what they why they wrote the work and what they plan to sort of accomplish with it, to give us a sense of what the book is about. And then I'll launch into a conversation with you, Darryl, about the book. And there are just so many dimensions to this. One dimension I'm definitely going to ask you about is your allergy to the term, I think very justifiable allergy to the term jihadism, which you've written about separately in addition to what you write in this book. But without further ado, if it's okay with you, Darryl, please, if you can give us a kind of broad overview of the text. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, Osama, so much for inviting me onto your program. As Osama mentioned, I wrote this book. It's called The Universal Enemy, Jihad, Empire, and the Challenge of Solidarity. And it's about a topic that has incited a huge amount of discourse, but in my opinion, not a ton of insight. And by that, I'm referring to the so-called foreign fighter jihadist phenomenon. Folks may be familiar with various invocations of jihad in today's politics, right? There's a lot of people in the world who do different things and call it jihad, right? It can be anything from, personal struggle to be a better person to acts of armed violence. And even among the acts of armed violence, there is an incredible heterogeneity of groups and actors that that invoke jihad, right? So whether we're talking about groups like Hamas or Hezbollah, or nation states engaged in war, or these sort of transnational mobilizations. And those are it's that last category that I'm really focusing on. So if we think, for example, about Muslims, especially Arabs, who traveled to fight against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s, that's kind of like the paradigmatic case that people often think about. And then that often gets collapsed with other groups like Al-Qaeda, the self-declared Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and a whole bunch of other actors. So the book really tries to address the so-called foreign fighter phenomenon. And I think that's the one that attracts both notoriety and analytical puzzlement, because these are folks who are, you know, they're not, it's hard to classify them as fighting for a nation state, right? They're not trying to eject a foreign occupier from their own homeland. They're not trying to take over their own government. They're engaged in a kind of transnational solidarity in the name of the Ummah. So that's what makes them interesting. It's also what makes them, allegedly scary. So as I said, this is, obviously there's many, many books written about this topic. What I think makes this book a little bit different is a couple things. One is, instead of starting with the idea that jihad is a problem that needs to be solved, whether through different forms of state violence, or it's a problem that Muslims feel like they have to sort of situate themselves in relation to by, apologizing or by distinguishing themselves, or reassuring other people that, these jihad actors don't represent Muslims and so on. My book tries to do something different, which is to say, well, instead of thinking of these jihads as a problem, what is it that they are supposed to be a solution to? And from that perspective, rather than pathologizing jihad as this problem, I just try to understand what the folks who were involved, were up to. How do they see the world? What are their claims? And to sort of take that seriously, which is a very sort of classic anthropological imperative. Now, of course, these solutions, so-called, have their own baggage. They have their own problems. They have their own exclusions and their own limitations. But I think it's very different to critique something on its own terms, as opposed to just dismissing it out of hand as crazy, essentially, which I think is what a lot of the war on terror discourse does. The other thing that I think makes this book different from a lot of other books on contemporary jihad practices is that it's based in research. So the book focuses on the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the 1990s and the participation of several thousand Muslims from around the world, many of them Arabs, in that war. So these folks traveled from many different countries, and again, in the name of of the Ummah and of defending Muslims in Bosnia who were facing genocidal violence and ethnic cleansing. And this group of people was eventually consolidated mostly into a special battalion or katiba in the Bosnian army. So you have an interesting situation where a so-called jihadist fighting force run predominantly under a kind of Salafi orientation, although we can talk a little bit about what these labels mean later, led by Arabs, raising funds from abroad, yet fighting under the broad leadership of an avowedly secular multinational government, whose generals are often erstwhile communists, non-Muslims or non-practicing Muslims, and kind of trying to understand how that works. So again, in terms of research, the book is based on field work. I spent over a year in Bosnia interviewing former participants in the jihad, both Bosnians and non-Bosnians, as well as conducting archival research and interviews in a half dozen other countries. So the United States, UK, Egypt, Malaysia, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. And the book is based extensively on primary source research. So I have archival records from the Bosnian army, publications and memoirs in Arabic. And then the third thing that the book does that's different from other books on jihad has to do with the more kind of theoretical argument for anthropologists, which is to say, these folks are engaged in their own form of universalism, which makes it possible to kind of compare them to sort of, other universalist projects, kind of like international law, human rights, peacekeeping. So the second half of the book situates the jihad in relation to what I call other universalist projects. So there's one chapter on socialist non-alignment, there's another chapter on UN peacekeeping, and then the final chapter is on the war on terror. And these are very different things, so I don't want to flatten them entirely, but I do try to make the case that the way that the first half of the book tries to understand this jihad as a kind of transnational solidarity formation, where I track the movements of people across different contexts, and I try to understand how Muslims from different backgrounds find ways of dealing with cultural and racial and doctrinal differences. The second half of the book kind of tries to apply that methodology to things like the non-aligned movement, to UN peacekeeping, and to the war on terror. So that's the book in a nutshell. As Osama mentioned at the beginning, it's also informed by my experiences in litigation around the war on terror, especially several years spent during law school as part of the defense team for a captive being held at Guantanamo Bay. None of that material is in the book because there's all of these restrictions, information is classified, so I don't draw on any of that. But a lot of these war on terror legal debates are, of course, in the back of my mind. And part of the reason for that is when these things started, in the early 2000s, I was sort of in the human rights NGO world. And it was apparent to me very early on that the advocates, journalists, researchers who were trying to understand what was going on at Guantanamo and other places really didn't have a mental map to make sense of diasporic Muslim communities, right? So like the idea of like an Arab in Afghanistan, there was just something that was incongruous about that, right? And that played into the US government narrative of, well, if there's an Arab in Afghanistan, he must be up to no good, he must be an Al-Qaeda agent. So even for the well-intentioned critics of these practices, they just, aside from just asserting basic legal norms like torture is wrong, they didn't really have a social mapping and understanding of how to make sense of all of these different kinds of movements and migrations. Anyway, so that's that's kind of the short version of what the book is about and where it comes from.
Right. Thank you, Darryl. I mean, it really, you've actually touched on so many different elements of your book. And I think in 10 minutes, the ability to give a flavor of its diversity is really something you've been able to do. Something I'm somewhat impressed by, if you don't mind me saying so. I want to remind viewers that you can, and I would be more than happy to sort of take your comments and questions. We will you can write them out in the chat box on YouTube and on Facebook, and they will show up on my system. I don't think you can do it on Twitter. So, there are a number of things that you mentioned. The last thing you mentioned was just reminded me of the fact that when the race theory dimension of what you're dealing with, in a sense, or the question of endemic racism in the current dominant form of universalism, which is that if you're a Western, an indigenous Westerner, a white person who goes and lives in another part of the world, you're an expatriate. And you're usually sort of living it up on some level. You're financially remunerated on a level which is far superior to those who are local. Very often you have all sorts of perks that you can benefit from. And sometimes this is actually codified in local laws. So my father worked in Saudi Arabia in an international institution for a period, but he was somewhat underhandedly, as far as I understand, encouraged to register under his Bangladeshi passport rather than his British passport. And consequently, his salary was lower. And if he was British and white, as far as I understand, in the institutions in that country, the salaries could have been even higher. So there's, you're an expatriate, you're sort of, in a sense, white privilege on a global scale is carried with you where you travel. But if you're not afforded or not part of that tradition, and in a sense, those of us who live in the first world and live, are part of these institutions, as you are, the University of Chicago, myself at Oxford, to a certain extent, we can absorb elements of those privileges as well. Although, for someone like myself in conservative governed Britain, having sort of Bangladeshi heritage means, I don't know, if I go on the wrong side of the law, maybe I'll be dispossessed of my citizenship. Who knows? And so, those sorts of things are quite. And so that element of the book is really striking as well. That some of the people that have been really caught up in the war on terror dragnet that you talk about, and it really, it's full of anecdotes about these people throughout the text. And I understand you've changed the names of everyone involved, or almost everyone involved. In some cases, I understand that you say that they wanted their names to be used, are people who are just very sadly in the wrong place at the wrong time. And you have this, whether it's vis-a-vis the global sort of war on terror, or even the fact that someone got stopped by a Serbian on the way during his travels, and if he had received the wrong message on the phone call, the person could have been shot on the spot and killed. Can you give us a sense of like this dimension of displacement that occurs for individuals who've tried to make a home in a locale, and suddenly they are forced to move back to Egypt and can't even see their children or their families anymore?
Yeah, thank you. That's wonderful. Another way of thinking about the genesis of this project, and your question kind of prompted this, is that when the United States invaded Iraq, there was this discourse that came up in the media around this term foreign fighter, right? And the U.S. started saying, oh, this insurgency, it's all about the foreign fighters. The foreign fighters are the suicide bombers. And there's just this incredible lack of self-awareness in this term, right? That a large invading army that is committed, that is waging a war of aggression on this country. The way that you describe these people who you're up against is, as foreign fighters, right? Like that in itself already that's a symptom of what I mean when I talk about occupying the place of the universal, right? So the United States, without even thinking about it that much, without even, they can sort of speak as if anyone who they think is their enemy is also automatically the enemy of all mankind, right? And that's what it means to occupy the place of the universal, right? Like what you get to define who is universal, who is not. That's a little bit different from the more typical critique, which is they speak in the name of universal values and then they violate them. That's of course also true. But what I also want to do with the book is to treat universalism as like a practice that can be studied in the world structurally, and not just like a thing that people talk about and then violate. So anyway, what this gets to is sort of, with your point is, who's an expat and who's a migrant? How do we code and understand different forms of mobility? And often this is done in a way that's racialized, right? So the Arabs and other Muslims who come to Bosnia as mujahids, they tell the Bosnians, look, we're fellow Muslims, right? Even though, we might speak different languages and have slightly different backgrounds and so on and so forth. But the war on terror framework says these aren't fellow Muslims, they're foreign Arabs, right? And I want to be very clear that the war on terror framework in its liberal versions claims not to be targeting Islam. And actually, it's not just that they claim this, because of course people can see through that. They claim to be the guardians of Muslim pluralism, because the war on terror logic is essentially that there are all of these good moderate Muslims who need to be protected from the crazy foreign Salafi, et cetera, fighters, right? So a lot of the logic of how the U.S. empire works is through, influencing nation-state governments that are on paper independent and sovereign and juridically equal, but of course everyone knows they to varying degrees operate under enormous pressure from the United States. And Bosnia is a really important case for this. So shortly after the attacks of 9/11, among the first people sent to Guantanamo Bay who were not captured in Afghanistan or Pakistan were 6 Algerians who were arrested by the Bosnian government because the U.S. claimed that they were an al-Qaeda cell, and they were held for 3 months in Bosnian jails and eventually released because there was no evidence against them. The U.S. had promised to hand over evidence against them. The Bosnians were like, "We're ready," and the evidence was never forthcoming. So the court ordered them released, and the U.S. ambassador went to senior Bosnian officials and basically said, if you don't hand these people over to us, we will cut off all foreign aid and we will end your country. So under this enormous pressure, the Bosnian authorities handed over the 6 Algerians. They were sent to Guantanamo, and actually they were the plaintiffs whose name ended up on the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case in 2008 that gave Guantanamo captives access to U.S. courts. So this early case in Bosnia really showed the global pretensions and scope of the war on terror, right? Where the US was picking up people from all over the world. And I think it's also very important that audiences understand, because I think this is something that people still are not always aware of, that prisons directly run by the US, like Guantanamo, Bagram, Abu Ghraib, and so on, they are the tip of the iceberg of the war on terror. If we think of the war on terror as a global exercise in policing transnational Muslim mobility, by far most of that work is done by client states, right? It's done by other governments, and those people who they capture and torture and interrogate, those are names that we don't know for the most part. Those are cases that never made it into a US courtroom, were probably never exposed to human rights organizations or to the media. That is actually the bulk of the violence of the war on terror that to this day remains sorely understudied and underexposed.
And in a sense, it's understudied because it's not studyable, to coin a phrase. I mean, it's. I think I sort of got this towards the later part of your book, but you were saying that the US, is always desirous of having those sorts of outlets to do this sort of dirty work, precisely because it just keeps it off its books. The internal culture of the US, and you as a lawyer will know this, is highly legalistic. Everything has to be. I mean, you make this striking remark about the fact that people very often think of the war on terror as being this domain of no laws, whereas it's actually highly legalized mechanisms of, controlling and projecting of empire. I mean, I wonder, because you have these interesting comments. You're not defending universalism per se as a sort of like, when you're characterizing the jihadists as engaged in a kind of universal project of solidarity, I see that you're not necessarily taking sides in this discussion either. You are critiquing sort of the US project, and this is something which I, as a kind of believing Muslim, so to speak, often find a little frustrating, with the way in which intellectuals will deconstruct in traditions of, particularly in anthropology and other fields, but not necessarily have sort of a view of their own which is very concrete. And I respect every scholar's right to do that. I'm just saying that my automatic tendency personally, as kind of a believer, is to think in terms of systems, and perhaps that's something we can come to later, and you can sort of critique why I should maybe dispense with that. My question is, like you say, towards the intro, you do make this remark: the world, and I'm quoting here, that world order is an era of what can loosely be understood as American empire. So we live in a time of American empire where the US has this ability to apply disproportionate force, and it's not often seen. It's basically behind closed doors diplomacy, in the way that you described in Bosnia, and this can happen to all states. Although states as weak and precarious as Bosnia are very susceptible to this. And in the Trump era, we saw how the EU had to manage sort of US aggression on the diplomatic level. But, in a sense, you also say universalism itself is problematic. At least this is how I read it, and you can correct my reading. Universalism has a necessarily ambivalent relationship with violence. A message directed at all humanity must regard itself as self-evidently compelling enough not to require coercion, yet valuable enough to preserve and defend by force. And so I guess I want to ask, is universalism like a problem, in a sense? If that makes sense as a question. in your reading?
Yeah, I mean, it's an endlessly generative and interesting problem. It's an intellectual problem. Um, so I'll say a couple things about how I think about universalism. One is that it's funny, as an anthropologist, universalism is like our favorite pinata or whipping boy. It's so when I talk about universalism, it's definitely not a form of praise. At the same time, I think there's no such thing as completely getting rid of universalism, right? In fact, if you were to make the most extreme version of that claim, that like there are no universalisms, there's only particularisms, I mean, that is itself also a universal claim, right? So there's kind of just a logical, circularity issue. But anyway, all I'm trying to say is, for anthropologists, the book kind of says, hey, think twice before using this word, which we use all the time in the discipline. And instead of using it, as anthropologists typically do, as like a shorthand for like bad forms of homogenizing Western capitalism, like how do we think about it as a practice that can be studied in the world? And I'm very clear that the argument is not that Islam is a universalism or liberalism is a universalism. Like these are extremely large and messy categories. So when I talk about universalisms or universalist projects, I'm talking about concrete efforts by specific people in the world where they are trying to enact a vision that's directed at all of humanity, and necessarily have to confront and deal with differences at the same time. And the idioms through which they do that can come from all sorts of different intellectual, religious, other traditions and resources, right? So they might be Islamic, they might be liberal, they might be both. And but it's really a kind of like bottom-up approach to universalism that I'm trying to get at. Anyway, I feel like we might be heading into a slightly more theoretical direction than some of the more concrete, like what's in the book and why people, who are not into universalism want to talk about. But I'm happy to go any direction that you want.
No, I think it's wise to stay at a level which is, accessible to a broader audience, and which gives us a better idea of the contents of your book. And in a sense, it's an academic book, but it's the sort of book which I think it's been written in a way that can be read by anyone and really benefited from. In the style of the anthropologist, it's full of these vignettes as well of your time in the field and these historical experiences that are narrated by people as well. I wonder if you have any particular interest in any sort of particular dimensions of that book that you would like to highlight in this sort of setting. Please do feel free to let me know. I have a certain direction of my interests, and I'm going to sort of ask about those inevitably. I sort of wanted to ask about the label Salafi, and this kind of links in with the notion of jihadism as well. You problematized the way in which Salafism and jihadism are, in a sense, fused very often. And Salafism isn't very popular sometimes among Muslims as well. Like there are large sections of Muslims who think, oh, Salafism is that stuff that comes from Saudi Arabia and is exported, etc. So a scholar at Cambridge, Abdul Hakim Murad, Tim Winter, you may have heard of him, a theologian based at the Divinity School, but he also runs what I think is a pioneering sort of Islamic college based in Cambridge, the Cambridge Muslim College. He's a Sufi scholar, an expert on Ghazali, a very learned scholar, undoubtedly, someone I've personally benefited from on a confessional plane. But he has very often very severely critiqued Salafism, and he's a Bosniaphile like yourself, and he's talked about how Salafis are very often not very welcome in Bosnia because, and so Saudi Arabia had the link with the Afghan Jihad, and how Bosnian conflict comes on the tail of that, draws in a certain type of international sort of solidarity, shall we say, to use the term that you used. I just wanted your thoughts on Salafism and how and your problematizing of the vilification of certain types of Salafism.
Yeah, well, first off, I think it's absolutely true and important to acknowledge the very real tensions that are at work. So, of course, in Bosnia, there is a very significant constituency of people who are, who see what they call, Wahhabi, like, as, Wahhabism as a threat, right? And I think this is also impossible to disconnect from um, not only Islamophobia or anti-Muslim animus, but also questions of race and the ambiguous place that European Muslims have in these sort of logics of racialization. And we can talk more about this later, maybe. But I think it's, I think it's fair to say that if you think about the circumstances of the war and the incredible violence that Bosniaks were undergoing, who were desperate for aid and assistance, from any place they could get it. There was a very strong discourse of emphasizing the Europeanness of Bosnia and Bosnian Muslims to combat the kind of anti-Muslim stereotyping that especially Serb and Croat nationalists were pushing. So the antidote to this was, all of this stuff about Bosnia is, this multicultural, tolerant place, and the kind of Islam in Bosnia is tolerant and it's European and it's modern. And again, I completely, I don't want to invalidate that discourse, but I think unintentionally sometimes it fed into other kind of, racist ideas in the West of like what Arabs or what non-European Muslims were doing. So I think for some Bosnian Muslims, the so-called Wahhabis from the Arab world or from elsewhere kind of represent the stereotype of everything that they felt like was being foisted upon them, and therefore there's a need to, distance themselves. That phenomenon exists, but it doesn't erase the fact that there were tensions, that there were people who were coming with interpretations of Islam, who sometimes saw Bosniaks as backwards in their Islam, as ignorant, whether because they had lived under communism, or even for those who see the Ottoman era as like an era of bid'ah or something like that. So, these, for me, I want to just, it's, I don't want to invalidate any of the perspectives in these debates, right? I think they all exist and they are all real, and also just sort of just take, to be mindful of the political and social context in which they're operating. How do we theorize Salafism as a category is a separate question. It's related, obviously, just like Sufism as well, right? Like, is Tasawwuf the same thing as Sufism? Like, what this ism thing is already, it already raises some pretty significant like philosophical questions or epistemological questions that, we can get into some more. And then, but I mean, I guess one thing to say is, if parsing these categories of Sufism and Salafism in general is already a fraught endeavor, when you take a label like Salafi and then slap it onto another label called Jihadism, right, and have something called Salafi Jihadism, right, then you have like essentially a car wreck of like different kinds of problematic things all coming together into what I think of as like a cluster of just really problematic category making and term making.
I mean, it's very expedient, of course, for empire to,
Of course,
bring together all the stuff that we hate, and we have marketed for, generations as being the epitome of evil in some respect. I mean, this, if we think about Said, or if we think about the way in which, actually Timothy Winter has written quite interestingly about this and quite thoughtfully, that Europe in some respects has defined itself historically in opposition to Islam, right? In the sense that Islam kind of is at the borders of Europe, and those borders have been threatening for a long time, whether it's the Ottomans, during the siege of Vienna, or migrants today. And so in those sorts of contexts, I think, that sort of visceral fear of the other is quite deeply embedded. And so these are very convenient shorthands to justify our visceral reactions to certain circumstances. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you sort of want to expand further on specifically on the label jihadism, because I also wanted to ask you, and you've just mentioned Sufism, but the problem of jihadism, so to speak, is something that you've also just kind of tied into in this book, the terrorism studies as an industry. And I don't know if I'm changing gears too quickly, but I kind of wonder whether or not you could elaborate on that relationship and the way in which it's integrated into the global war on terror. Because a lot of scholars, and this might include people I've worked with in the past, like my supervisor at Princeton was Bernard Haeckel, for example. A lot of people are integrated into this industry. The university is deeply implicated. I mean, I came from a department where Bernard Lewis was, very active for the last half of his life or so. How do we sort of understand those relationships? To what extent are we implicated in empire by being at places like Oxford or Chicago? And how do we understand the way in which a label like jihadism is used both as an analytic frame within a discursive formation in these rarefied centers of academic excellence, and also a blunt instrument to run roughshod over entire societies and countries and global sort of like communities? Sorry, that's a very big question. I hope it made sense.
It's actually two very big questions. So when it comes to the universities, of course, universities, and especially elite universities, are implicated in and responsible for any number of horrible things. And I love that you have the framing on the screen where the logos of our respective employers are beneath, which I don't want to take responsibility for all of the things that the University of Chicago has done, whether from the South Side to Chile under Pinochet or but specifically when we're talking about the jihadism discourse, I think the relationship is slightly more complicated in that, to a certain extent, in Middle East studies, you can say that the in the battle between Ansar Edward Said and Ansar Bernard Lewis, the Saidians arguably got the upper hand, and in kind of mainstream respectable Middle East studies, a lot of this work on so-called jihadism is marginalized and not taken seriously. And really where where a lot of the work in these categories happens is in these sort of interstitial spaces of think tanks, research centers, and so on. And this has actually become part of their critique, right? So the line that a lot of these people have is, the ivory tower is dominated by all of these, lefty, knee-jerk, anti-American types. And therefore, in order to do real serious work on this very real threat of jihadism, we have to have these other programs and these other spaces. Now, ideologically, I come from a completely opposite perspective from these people, but they're not entirely wrong in one specific sense, which is that I do think, for a whole bunch of reasons, some justified and some unjustified, work on contemporary jihad practices is not really done in most parts of the academy. And, it's difficult to do, obviously. But also there's that fear of how do you write about it without validating these sort of security discourses. So part of what I want to do with this book is to show how it is possible to take these movements and these groups seriously as, a phenomenon in the world that's worthy of being studied. And in that sense, I don't think I disagree with the terrorism studies crowd, but rather what I want to show is not only can this be done in a serious academic way, but it's better. Because I think in terms of the way that those folks fetishize the empirical methods and the like knowing languages and so on. I mean, I just feel like, look, honestly, with the terrorism studies stuff, 95% of it I don't need to read, because if you look at the footnotes in the bibliography, you know that there's no original research, there's no language, it's just very obvious and it's easy to dismiss. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a genuine thing to be researched there. It's just that it should be researched in a way that is also mindful of the hyper intense racist and imperial atmosphere in which the work is going to be received, right? So we just have to do both. We have to do the work, but we also have to be mindful of the conditions of its production. And I think that's where the security studies people can't. It's interesting. I think the post-Saidi and Middle East studies crowd sometimes they paint with a slightly too broad brush. What they don't realize is that a lot of the terrorism studies people are self-described liberals. They actually think that what they're doing is providing an alternative to the more kind of Trumpian, populist, racist. Now, I reject that argument. I think they're actually enabling it. But at least I understand, one, that they have a self-consciousness or self-identification as non-racist, and two, that they actually have a lot of resentment at being excluded from the academy, right? So in a weird way, it's like they some of them read what I do as punching down, which again, I don't know what to say. It's like, well, I still, I don't think my arguments are invalid for that reason. And
they usually
I
make
think,
a lot more money than we do.
Sorry?
And they also usually make a lot more money than we do. So
yeah, that's probably true. So there's a silver lining for them in that. But anyway, yes, that's just the university part. I mean, we can talk about conceptually the jihadism thing, or if you want to move on to something else, it's also fine.
No, I'm happy to go on to that. I was just going to add, I mean, like, as a throwaway comment, that because you said that they see us as punching down, and I've seen that sort of sentiment actually expressed sometimes by colleagues saying, oh, those think tanks, they don't know anything. We do the real work here in the academy. So there is a snobbery that very often is found in the academy. But, before we go on to the question of jihadism and the conceptual question, I wanted to just comment about, in a sense, your book can also be read as a critique of the way in which the academy has marginalized these discourses and left it in the hands of people who sometimes, as you point out, with the best of intentions, really make a pig's breakfast of it, shall we say. And that maybe that is the appropriate term, because obviously pigs are haram, and I think those interstitial spaces.
This, by the way, sorry, this is an Anglicism that just totally went over my head.
Sorry. Yes. I mean, it's an expression that we say in the UK. I don't know if it, but I mean, just in the sense that they make an absolute mess of it, but at the same time, those interstitial spaces, what you've described as interstitial spaces, are so deeply integrated into the state that they're actually far more central to the domain of power than the university, right? So it's not necessarily that they're marginal in that sense.
Well, yes and no. It's funny. The think tank folks are often frustrated that the policymakers don't take their advice. I think that they are important in a harmful way in how they shape kind of the vocabulary and the discourses and the assumptions of these things, but oftentimes their own specific prescriptions are ignored. So they have that's why I do think of them as interstitial. They feel that they are not taken seriously by the academy nor by the trigger pullers. Again, I'm not, I still think I still would not shed any tears if they were, institutionally abolished. But at least I'm just trying to give a sense of, their worldview and kind of the dilemmas as they see them.
I mean, that
I mean, put it this way: if I can empathize with so-called jihadis, right, then I can empathize with jihadologists, right?
Yeah, you're going to get me in trouble with that sort of a line. But I mean, I find that just interesting, and it kind of takes me in a slightly different direction, and I just want to get your insight on this, because you've obviously worked to a certain extent in a kind of interstitial space when you've done human rights work in the NGO sort of like setting. And I'm surprised. It kind of reflects the fact that I'm very unfamiliar with a lot of these spaces, but I'm somewhat surprised at the frustration that the think tank space might feel, and I assume the NGO space would feel it even more sort of pointedly, because you're even less sort of able to have an impact on governance. And the universities don't even try that. So in a sense, in the context of an informed deliberative democracy, so to speak, like why do we even exist, so to speak, as institutions? I wonder if you want to humor me and reflect a little on how do these governments do anything? Like, is it all sort of Dick Cheneys of the world, just conspiring in their Darth Vader cupboards, or is there something sort of more profound going on in a democracy that allows for a more thoughtful way of developing policymaking? This is kind of, I'm indulging my opportunity to ask you a question.
I mean, of course, I don't have any insight, into the black box of government. I think what I would say is that I don't subscribe to kind of a classic Habermasian view of a public sphere through which rational debate. I mean, I came of age during the invasion of Iraq, and this is one of those things where all the experts, quote unquote, could tell you exactly what was going to happen, and it did happen. So I learned the lesson. It's funny because as an Asian immigrant in the United States, I was subjected to very intense indoctrination in the ideology of meritocracy, right? That especially a country like the United States, if you're smart, you work hard, you go to the right schools, you can change. So this idea that the better arguments will prevail because they are better arguments, is something that I was raised with, and learned pretty early on that the limitations of that idea. But it is a conceit that that undergirds many of the institutions in which we're operating: universities, NGOs, think tanks, and so on. I don't think it therefore means we should just quit. I think what it means is we should be mindful of specific conversations and specific contexts and specific audiences, right? So there isn't one giant undifferentiated public, right? That we just kind of say something and they either believe it or they don't, right? But we can try to identify groups of people we want to build with, and socially embedded movements and so on, right? And this is also why the advocacy around the war on terror was always so self-limiting, right? In the United States, think about it, like you have essentially a small, relatively elite/elitist cadre of policy people, lawyers, and so on, people such as myself, operating with no accountability to and very little connection with any kind of social broad-based movement. Like, looking back, the fact that all of this advocacy around Guantanamo and torture and so on hardly ever engaged with the unprecedented expansion of a racial carceral state in the United States, the largest prison system ever, deeply marked by white supremacy and anti-blackness, just completely off the radar screen. Not only off the radar screen, a lot of the war on terror advocacy mobilized this idea of America's a good country, it just lost its way, right? So, we have to think about, like, who concretely we want to talk to, right? And those might be smaller numbers, but those might be more resonant conversations, precisely because they are more specific and more embedded.
It's fascinating. I mean, your tone there is very hopeful, but what you said was quite pessimistic in many respects. I mean, it reminded me of a kind of Gramscian sort of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, and I admire that. But and it reminds me of also a scholar and activist I admire a great deal, who's a mutual friend of ours, Asim Qureshi, who actually does try and sort of like sit in that space between the sort of the grassroots and the sort of scholar. And I think he relatively successfully links those two with his NGO Cage, where he's the director of research. But at the same time, I think a lot of the time, communities and community leaders will keep or historically will have kept NGOs like that at arm's length for the fear of what the state will do if they drew them closer. And so it really is a situation where power is highly centralized, obviously, in the modern state in an unprecedented fashion. And everyone's running scared of it. Or if you can't beat them, join them kind of as well. It's a fascinating and somewhat disturbing state of affairs. I we could go down that path, and I had another question related to it, but I will leave it to the side. And if I have the opportunity, I might bring it back to a question of, the raison d'etre of institutions like the ACLU and free speech and things like that. But we can leave that to the side for the time being. I wanted to go back to the reflection you were poised to make on categories like Salafism or kind of. I think you were going to explore it more analytically. Is that fair to say? Like, we kind of did one half of a broader discussion.
Oh, I think I was going to talk about jihadism rather than Salafism.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
I mean, on Salafism, I think there's a lot of interesting debates on this. I find Henri Lozier's book to be pretty helpful in disentangling what the word Salafi means in different contexts, right? So someone can be, Salafi aqidan versus Salafi fiqhan, right? And like, what does that mean? Sorry, do I need to translate that for your audience, or is that?
I mean, I think it might help. I can sort of I can assist if that's useful.
No, it's fine. I just don't want to, you can talk about being Salafi in terms of their creedal orientation, right? Absolutely. As really emphasizing unicity or tawheed. That's not exactly the same thing as being Salafi in the context of jurisprudence, right?
Rejection of madhahib and things like that.
Exactly, right? Like, oftentimes those things will be correlated, but they're not necessarily. So, there's a whole important scholastic debate on what we mean when we talk about Salafism as a noun, right? Like a Salafiyya as a noun, right? That's Anyway, with jihadism, the way that I think about it is, first there's like some pretty standard objections that I think are fine. Like, there's many different. I've had many people try to school me on like, jihad doesn't, there's the greater jihad and the lesser jihad, and the lesser one is a violent one, and I'm like, okay, that's cool, but I'm just talking about people in the world who are engaged in violence and who understand it as jihad. So I'm not, for me to come in and say, you guys got it wrong is is not really. Yeah, exactly, right? So there always has been, and there always will be, bayn al-mu'mineen, like debates about what is jihad properly, normatively, right? So everything from people who think it's, being a good person, all the way to all the different kinds of violence, and there's criteria and there's frameworks for those debates, whether we're talking about fiqh or something else or whatever. I think that the category of jihadism as a noun, what it's doing is essentially, it is in the name of social science and objectivity and not being situated within Islamic traditions. This category of jihadism comes in and has to pick some subset of these things that Muslims call jihad and building a category around those, without really having excellent criteria for doing so. And actually, not only that, they're usually picking the things that are the most controversial, most widely criticized, and then making that paradigmatic of jihadism, right? Moreover, and of course that plays into all of the racist politics of like making Muslims condemn things and blah blah blah, like all that garbage that we know about. But conceptually, there's another problem, which is that you might think, if you're like a good liberal terrorist expert, that you want your category, you want your definition of jihadism to be very targeted. It's kind of like a drone strike, very targeted, very specific, very narrow, so that you're only getting the bad guys, right? And not being racist and not attacking Islam. But paradoxically, the narrower your definition of jihadism, the larger is the residual category of things that Muslims call jihad, but which you have declared to not be jihadism, right? It opens up the problem of the non-jihadist jihad. So, for example, some of these books like the Shiraz Meher book, or Daniel Lab's book, they'll often have definitions like, well, first they try to link it to Salafism as like a doctrinal thing, and I think people are aware that that's problematic, because Salafis, of course, come out in all sorts of different ways on questions of jihad, and there's also, people need to be aware that there's like Sufis who are into jihad, whatever. I mean, that's all, again, let's just assume that that's obvious, but like at a core conceptual issue is, they'll say things like, oh, well, people who reject the nation state as a structure. Okay, bro. Then where's al-Azami in this, right? Like, where are all the people who are engaged in jihad, who are socially recognized as doing this, but who don't fit your definition? So I kind of take a much more like baseline I mean, you could be nominalist. You could say jihadism is anything any Muslim calls jihad. Sure, but then what are you going to do with that category, like conceptually, right? Like as a social science, and also what ends up happening in a lot of these things is a label like jihadism becomes a way to group together all the times Muslims are being violent in ways that essentially Western elites don't like. Yeah, exactly. A Muslim in the U.S. military who might be participating in a war of aggression on Iraq, they're a violent Muslim, but they're not a violent Muslim, if you catch my drift, right? And they might see their service in the American military as compatible with faith, right? There's all sorts. I mean, there's many fuqaha who will give you that opinion.
Not many,
like
but
yes, but
we'll find them.
But again, if you are speaking outside of the tradition, right? Unless you're going to start coming in and talking about, whose fatwa is more legit than who, that's very tricky territory. So, or like, a Muslim, you probably have distant Bangladeshi cousins who are in the NYPD right now, right?
Almost certainly.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, you get my point, right? Like, we talk about violent Muslims. These categories get thrown around in ways that reproduce a lot of these ideological dynamics. But also, putting that aside and the harm that creates, it's just incoherent, because you start putting together, Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, the Ottoman Empire in World War I, Iran and Iraq during their war. You group that together, and then you disconnect them from, say, non-Muslim or secular groups that might be engaged in structurally similar kinds of political conflict, right? So anyway, all this is to say why I just don't talk about jihadism. I don't even know what that means. I feel like every time the word leaves my mouth, I lose 10 brain cells. And I just don't think we should write books or have conferences or do things that are, of course, there's people who do things in the world, they call it jihad. We should study that. That's great. I'm not against that. But I do think, calling it jihadism is strange. I think this is also where there's an interesting, like, there's the emergence of jihadi as a noun in Arabic, I think is pretty recent. And there's I haven't done all the homework on this, but I think it's fair to say it's a translation from the West. Mujahid versus, someone was telling me that in Turkish, like, jihadi is pejorative, mujahid is not, right? I think in Urdu, jihadi as a noun is like, has less negative connotations, but I'm not totally sure.
But again, mujahid would kind of be the sort of, in a sense, the more it would have approbation attached to it, as opposed to a jihadi. I mean, I don't think anyone really self-describes as jihadi. And you've touched on your entire sort of reflection on the category of jihadism and jihadi really mirrors struggles that I have with the category of Islamism. And I've been struggling. Like, I came into Oxford and I was teaching a course where Islamism was in the title, and I had to teach the first year with that. And my first session is like the problem with Islamism as a label, because what the hell is Islamism, right? I mean, where does this name come from? It comes from the West, as far as I can tell. It basically is adopted by sort of people in the Middle East, because probably news wires like Reuters are constantly translating these things into Arabic automatically with their people, and they're just automatically doing this kind of loan translation without too much reflection. But it's a categorical sort of like nightmare, and it reflects ideological prejudices that are necessary for the upholding of empire, usually American empire. So the conversation sometimes that I've broached is, and you can I'm going to sort of actually replay what you've just said, and I feel as though we could spend a lot of time talking about this, and there might be a benefit to actually writing more extensively about this. I certainly would like to write about Islamism, but I'd love to see you write sort of, I mean, not to be prescriptive in any way, obviously, but about sort of the problem of jihadism, because it's such a ubiquitous category. But Islamism is very often used as a synonym with political Islam. What the hell is political Islam, right? And I appreciate Peter Mandeville's kind of problematizing of that expression, drawing on Talal Asad in the third sort of retitled version of his text. It was originally called Global Political Islam, and he retitled it Islam and Politics. I use that as a textbook sometimes. And one of the things I say is, well, Ali Gum'a, who's the former Grand Mufti of Egypt, who supported the Sisi regime, or Ahmed al-Tayyib, who supported the Sisi regime, they're Muslims who are engaging intimately in politics in the name of Islam. They're Islamists in that case, right? They're political Islamists. Like, why are we labeling the Muslim Brotherhood as political Islamists? Why are we putting them on, like Mohammed bin Zayed and his foreign minister, his brother Abdullah bin Zayed, who are setting up these think tanks and hiring people like Hamza Yusuf, a scholar, aside from these sort of interactions, I've historically had a great deal of respect for is someone, they're all Islamists according to that definition, right? Why are they going around vilifying the label Islamist in that case? Why are they putting some of these Islamists on terrorism lists? They should put themselves on terrorism lists in that case. But it's really to justify their own power, ultimately. And, one of the, forgive me for sort of like editorializing in this way, but and maybe plugging my own sort of work, but I argue in, my forthcoming book that, in a sense, ISIS and the autocracies in places like Abu Dhabi are twins. They're two sides of the same coin. They need each other to exist. And, to label one as Islamist and extremist misses the fact that actually that label equally applies to the opposite. It's the use of violence to justify a certain religious narrative. And, the violence of those that command states is always far superior, far greater, and kills far greater numbers of people than people organized as these small terrorist cells and so on. Sorry, I went off on a rant.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean,
yeah.
I think just to expand on your point, like, would anyone call the Emirates a secular state? Like, what does that mean? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think So I think you're absolutely.
Sisi has stated that he thinks the Sheikh al-Azhar should sort of abdicate his religious authority, and it should be in the hands of the state, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's a theocrat, right? These are all theocrats, according to, but they're portrayed as these secular rulers who are going to protect us against, Islamist terrorists and so on. Yeah.
And this is where the work of Assad and his students is so important, in really like problematizing, I hate that word, but secularism. Like, what do we mean? What not like, what does this word mean? How do we have a better definition of secularism, right? But rather, how are people using this category in the world to do things, to harm people, right? To shore up their power, et cetera, et cetera.
No, I mean, I think these are sort of these are major challenges, which I think we're going to have these arguments for a long time, because it is quite well established that these are the discursive norms of our times, that we use secular in certain sort of, it's coded in certain ways. Jihadism is coded in certain ways. And this is another reason why I really appreciate your text, because it's that kind of intervention that we need. And I hope more people will read it and, reflect on those sorts of ideas in the way that you have really brought out in a very useful way. I wanted to remind people we're probably going to be around, a bit longer, but if you have any questions for Darryl, this is your opportunity. I wanted to share just one comment from a regular of our show, someone who has the screen name Black Viper, says, "Assalamu alaikum. I love this book." So I just wanted to, there are people out there, even lay people, so to speak, who are not in the rarefied sort of worlds of the academy, who are really benefiting from your book, and I appreciate that. I also wanted to just share, I mean, unfortunately, it's just a URL. I've shared it on Facebook and YouTube. So this is, Darryl's sort of brief introduction to his book, and he reflects on the category of jihadism there as well. But yeah, thank you so much for your time and for these reflections. If it's okay, maybe we can spend another 10 minutes or so exploring, a few other dimensions. And if there are any things that you wanted to pick up on what we've already said, I just wanted to quote one or two things, and if you're happy to, you can comment on them as well. But you quote towards the end, I don't think it was in the non-alignment chapter, but it was one of these chapters on alternative universalisms. You quote a scholar called Peter Cunliffe. I believe his book is called Legions of Peace. And you say Peter Cunliffe has argued that contemporary peacekeeping should be understood as part of imperial multilateralism that is more decentralized and diffuse and liberal than older forms of empire. I wanted to ask you, you also pointed out that the terrorism studies folks, a lot of them are liberals who are trying to find these alternatives to the Trumpian sort of like bomb them, bomb their families kind of attitude. But you've problematized them as being part of this kind of ultimately global war on terror, which is highly illiberal in some sense. Although, I mean, if we think about the origins of liberalism, it's very complex, right? I mean, we can think of people like John Stuart Mill, whose father was an imperial administrator or a colonial administrator, who says what he says about the Indians on Liberty, right? I mean, just for the benefit of people who may be less familiar, he says that, these are civilizations in their infancy, and they need to be under the tutelage of, a place like Britain that ostensibly is a greater civilization than the vast civilization of India, the richest place in the world at the time. I just wonder if you want to sort of elaborate your thoughts about imperial multilateralism as a more liberal form of empire. And you can take it in another direction if you like as well. Sorry.
No, I think it's just kind of reiterating the basic point that the United States attains global hegemony on the ruins of decolonization. And even the earlier phase of American regional hegemony in Latin America came on the ruins of the Spanish Empire and the emergence of independent republics. So the US style, of course, the US does its own direct colonial. The US is a settler colonial state, so just native genocide and ongoing forms of dispossession to this day. So there's that. You also have, of course, direct rule in places like Puerto Rico, Guam, and so on. But in most of the world, the preference of the United States is to engage in what Kwame Nkrumah called neo-colonialism, right? So maximum sort of, I forget what he has a very evocative phrase that I quote in the book, but it's essentially a way of having of maintaining power while reducing responsibility, right? If you're the British Empire, I mean, again, I don't want to draw too strict a division, because the British Empire was incredibly diverse internally, and there are different forms of protectorates and indirect rule, and but the American thing is really like, okay, you guys, you take out your own garbage, you clean your own streets. Let's just make sure that like we get our oil, and we'll be less, we may be less involved in kind of the day-to-day running of things, which is a concession to the mobilizations of anti-colonial nationalism. Right. I mean, these things didn't happen just, they didn't spring like Athena diabolically from the head of this perverse Zeus. I mean, these are contingent outcomes of political struggles, right? We couldn't get Sisi without Tahrir, right? So anyway, a whole other thing. But what Cunliffe calls imperial multilateralism in his book on peacekeeping, and I think it's Philip Cunliffe, if I'm not mistaken. There's this idea out there that UN peacekeeping, of course, is you find it in the global south and not in the global north. With the Yugoslav wars in the 90s being this sort of interesting, borderline case.
Right.
And the vast majority of the work of UN peacekeeping is done by armies from the global south. And what the peacekeeping chapter argues is there's a lot of continuity between imperial armies, especially in South Asia, and the fact that India and Pakistan are so disproportionately represented in UN peacekeeping is very much connected to the legacy of the British Imperial Army, of the British Indian Army, I should say, right? Because it wasn't just that the British came and got some locals to collaborate in keeping the peace. It's that the British Indian Army was so large and so powerful, and at one point, I think the largest volunteer army in the world, that they were a crucial part of projecting British imperial power throughout the world, in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, in Europe, right? And of course, now there is a lot of this, it's actually really interesting in India in particular, there's a lot of this like World War II nostalgia, like we were there too, which anyway, that's a whole other, there's a lot to be said there. But what but in the chapter basically says, hey, wait a minute, we talk about Muslim foreign fighters in a place like Bosnia, but actually the largest number of Muslim foreign fighters in Bosnia were the UN peacekeeping forces. They were Jordanians, they were Pakistanis, and these folks were also acting in the name of the Ummah at the same time as thinking of themselves as part of the UN, the international community, and there wasn't this like deep contradiction, right? So I'm not, I reject the kind of Huntingtonian dichotomy there, and there were interesting overlaps, right? So there was one individual, a Malaysian army officer, who went to Bosnia to help Muslims there. He was part of the UN's peacekeeping force. He gets disillusioned, and then he joins the Jihad battalion and he's a Sandhurst graduate, so he has he knows a lot of things, he trains them, and for them, it's just sort of, for him, it's like, look, he wanted to help Muslims in Bosnia. The UN was one way of doing it, the Jihad was another way of doing it. And that, I think, is a really helpful case in understanding, a more textured way of thinking of universalism that's not just, okay, we have the West and we have Islam, right? Like the UN force is a Muslim army in large part, in significant part. I think they were like 30% Muslim, right? So I want to, be cognizant of that diversity without kind of like getting back into these like old tired categories, West versus Islam, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. No, that's extremely helpful. And I mean, really fascinating that for that person, that jump made perfect sense. But in sort of post 2001 global war on terror context, it's basically you're going from black to white, you're going from good to evil. And I mean, this is, I like William Kavanagh's book, The Myth of Religious Violence. I mean, the fact that certain types of violence is coded as religious and salient, and the most prevalent forms of violence in the world today, which are perpetrated by states, often on their own people, but also in the international arena, is invisible to us. It really, the global war on terror makes it invisible to us, to my mind at least. But it's all pervasive, and it's incredible. It's an incredible sort of like testament in a negative way to the ingenuity and the creative minds that have come behind creating this kind of illusion. It's kind of like the Maya of sort of the modern world, as it were. Yeah, I mean, I this is one of the things which I really appreciated. I'm saying it again about your book, that and it's not said enough. I mean, once you've chipped away at it in the way that you've done so in this text, and the way that someone like William Kavanagh does in a slightly different context, you start seeing it everywhere. And I think more people, should read these kinds of works to start seeing that. I wonder, I'm a little conscious of time, and I wonder if I should ask you one more question. It'll probably not be too long, but it's really as long as you want to make it, about just a bit about Abdullah Azzam, because I think you spent a bit of time on him to complicate these stories, and he's come up once or twice, but recently you also critique Thomas Hegghammer, who's recently published a book about him. I've not read the book yet. I read Hegghammer's book, Jihad in Saudi Arabia, probably around 2013 or something like that, or maybe a bit earlier than that, while I was at Princeton. And he had been at Princeton. I arrived just as he'd left, so I didn't ever meet him. But I thought that was I thought that was a very nice book, to be honest. Like, with the mindset I had at the time, I have to reread it now, having read your book and having sort of like over the last few years disentangled these kinds of normative structures that are deeply embedded in my thinking, or were. He's one of these people who is more liberal, right? I mean, he's really trying to create the space. But you point out that scholars like that, and I've realized I'm asking two questions now: one about Azam, but another about the terrorism industry, and we've kind of covered that, so you don't need to necessarily go there again. Why is Azam different? What makes him really sort of like disrupt the standard narratives about jihadism, and particularly Salafi jihadism? Do you want to just elaborate that for as long as or as short as you like?
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to that question. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't. When you say that Azam is different, what do you mean? Because I feel like he's become this canonical. I think the standard story is, you draw a straight line from, Ibn Taymiyyah to Sayyid Qutb to Abdullah Azam to Osama bin Laden to Daesh, right? If you say a bit more about
So what I'm thinking is,
Azam?
Azam is someone who straddles the Azhar as an institution.
Yes.
He did a doctorate there. So very much like a traditionalist authority. He's an alim. He's also a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, as I recall correctly, which doesn't fit into the standard jihadist narrative.
Yeah.
And I'm not very well read on his actual doctrines, but my expectation would be he would have been Salafi in Aqidah, but pretty much nothing else. And Salafism and Aqidah is quite sort of like it's not controversial. It's not as controversial as. Well, I guess no. I'm going to take that back because
I guess we could say it's politically underdetermined.
Okay, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, I mean,
like,
it doesn't
you could be Salafi and Al-Qaeda and come out with all sorts of different positions on various issues of the day, right?
Right, absolutely, like the Saudi religious establishment. But yeah, I mean, for me, I remember watching. This may reflect my ignorance, but watching one justification of jihad in Afghanistan from Azam in one of these lectures you can find on YouTube, and he basically was citing sort of Hanafi sources, and he was citing like Ibn Taymiyyah didn't really figure a great deal, and I came away feeling, wait, is this person particularly schooled in the Hanafi method? Maybe he's actually a Hanafi, which gave me a certain degree of sort of affinity with him automatically, as it were. So yeah, I mean, just by being Azhari, he kind of bucks the Salafi trend, I would think. And he's someone who respects the nation state in some sense, in the sense that he's not there to sort of put an end to the international order as we see it. He just wants to defend Muslim sort of like majority states in that context.
Apologies for the self-promotion. I have an article that talks about this a bit from 2012 in the Arab Studies Journal, and in it I talk about the Sufi influences and engagements of some of Azam's writing. So the terrorist expert attention has largely been focused on the famous fatwa, right? Defense of the Muslim lands, and this idea that jihad in Afghanistan is fard ayn, is a duty on individual Muslims, and that duty proceeds kind of concentrically from the Afghan people to the neighboring Muslim populations to Muslims all over the world. Now, I think as a juristic argument, this has been widely criticized because, a fard ayn is like salat, right? It's, but the idea that like all able-bodied Muslims in the world go to this one place. I mean, people, I think, Hegghammer mentions that Turabi kind of, ridiculed this. And so I think, as a fard, as an obligation, juristically, the reasoning raises eyebrows. I think the practical effect of this argument is to, in the book I say it's more about license than about obligation. It's about telling folks, look, your government may or may not say it's okay. Your parents may or may not say it's okay, but it's okay if you want to go. That is arguably undermining nation state authority at some level. Adnan Zulfikar has an article where he kind of goes through the logic of the fatwa. But yeah, it's not a wholesale rejection of the nation state system. And Azam is very conscious about making sure that Arab participation in the Afghan jihad is situated within an Afghan context, right? He respected the authority of the Afghan Mujahideen leaders, and of course he had his biases. He picked his favorites, but it wasn't like he wanted Arabs to come in and like just take over the whole show, right? I mean, that just logically wouldn't even make sense. So yeah, Azam is so part of what I say about Azam, I mean, the book is not about Azam. He just kind of pops up here and there, but I think he's helpful to remind us that for the types of jihads that this book is about, it's more useful to think about solidarity as a political framing than rulership, right? Because 99% of what's out there is about, an Islamic State, right? And those debates already presuppose that we're in kind of like a certain nation state framework. Azam is, of course, he supports the Afghans because they want to create an Islamic State. But this whole, what does it mean to have an Islamic State in that context is it's a little iffy, which also connects with your thing about Islamism. In the Afghan context, especially, I think Islamism is it's a very, very strange label, because you have all of these like Mujahideen factions that are built off of the Sufi turuq, that are not like Islamist in the way that like Hizb Islami of Hekmatyar is Islamist, right? Or Jamiat of Rabbani and those folks. Anyway, sorry, that's, perhaps a bit too much in the weeds. But with Azam, if you want to take Azam's political thought seriously, it's about solidarity more than it is about rule, right? He could, when you're talking about fighting the Soviets, like how you construct an Islamic State, what does Sharia look like? Those are questions that are quite far down the line. The other thing about Azam that I talk about in the book is his writing on miracles or karamat is something that needs to be taken seriously as a form of political theology, right? Up until now, it's pretty much written about as like propaganda, like, oh, this, gets people all worked up to go and fight. And, part of what I want to show in the book is that the way that he talks about karamat is also a helpful way to think about how authority is distributed in a solidarity movement, as opposed to the way that miracles are often thought of as a model for sovereign power inside of a nation state.
Right.
Anyway, that might, again, be a little bit too kind of like, it might be nerding it up a little bit too much. But, I think, yeah, all of this is to say that Azam's mysticism and his engagement with the Tasawwuf is extremely interesting and important to understand alongside his more widely acknowledged sort of juristic commitments.
So I'm just gonna, for the benefit of the sort of viewers, I'm putting on the screen the title of your article from 2012. So taking the place of martyrs, Afghans and Arabs under the banner of Islam. Forgive me, that's kind of bunched into each other as on the screen. Yeah, I think when I say sort of Azam wasn't opposed to the nation state, that's actually not entirely sort of like fair, in the sense that what I mean by that is that wasn't sort of in the crosshairs in the way that it has been for ISIS, for example. But at the same time, the nation state is something I say sometimes in the classroom, in a context where nuance is sort of appreciated, is that the nation state is part of it. For me, the existence of the nation state in the Muslim world reflects ongoing colonialism, right? It reflects ongoing divide and rule of a certain type. in the sense that the adoption of nationalism as an ideology is a success, epistemic success of the colonial powers in many respects. And there might be alternative ways of creating solidarity that do not presuppose the nation state as a structure. I also, I mean, in light of what you've said about global American empire, how real is the nation state in practice, right? To what extent is Bosnia sovereign, or even the EU and its various states are, to what extent are they sovereign next to the power of the United States? So I'm not a legal scholar, so I may be misusing this term, but it's a legal fiction of sorts, right? That allows for the system to persist while the ideal is never really realized in some sense. Wallahu a'lam. I've really appreciated your time. Thank you so much for explicating your fascinating book, very important book that I read the entire text and I read through much of the footnotes, and once I sort of realized just how lengthy the footnotes themselves were, and I noticed you were using sort of drawing on WikiLeaks and these sorts of documents as well as the secondary literature, and I do encourage people to try and get their hands on the book and have a read of it. I think if you don't mind me saying so, I think if this sort of book is taken seriously, it could really introduce a step change in the way that we think about these sorts of discourses, really. And I think you're taking this on from people like Asad and bringing it to the realm of jihadism or anti-jihadism as a discourse, so to speak. And I really appreciate your doing that. If it's okay, I'm just going to briefly mention that next week I might be off the air. I will, the audience, please sort of just keep track of my Facebook and Twitter. But the following week, Omar Anshasi will be back doing his Islamic book review. So I have a colleague, Darryl, who will be sort of sitting in your seat next week, not literally, but on your side of the screen, who will be familiar to many of my audience. And I look forward to welcoming him then. But Darryl, please stick around. But if you would like, I don't know if you want to say anything in concluding, or as we sort of bring this to a close.
No, just, thank you so much, Osama. It was just a really rich conversation. I hope it's funny because we and this is not a criticism, I think we talked around the book because it opens up a lot of questions. But for folks who want to know what's in it, a lot of the first half is really just stories of people who traveled and fought and the challenges that they experienced, including in just getting around in a strange foreign country, right? And how they related to and how they discovered Bosnia as well. And so I hope that those parts of the book are interesting and relatively accessible to a wider audience. It's just that there's a fair bit of conceptual brush clearing you need to do to even make a story like that legible. Right. So that's why there are all these other questions that come up. But yeah, I think for a lot of folks, the stories themselves may be of interest, and at least that's what I hope folks get out of it. Anyway, thank you again so much. It was really a pleasure.
It really has been my pleasure and my honor. I think you're absolutely right. There's in typical anthropological style, of course, there are lots of fascinating vignettes throughout the text. These little stories that humanize, I think, a highly dehumanized discourse. And so that's of great value. But because the text is so evocative of so many different themes that are so, I think, important to explore, we've just had a great hour and a half discussing them. And I really appreciate, again, your time, Darryl. And with that, I would like to thank everyone who's been joining and watching. You've stuck with us for an hour and a half, and we really appreciate it. And inshallah, we'll see you either in a week or in a couple of weeks' time. But thank you, Darryl, once again for giving us this opportunity. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.